to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Julian, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Julian Schvindlerman. He is based in Argentina. He's a writer of an author of several books. He frequently contributes articles to varying publications. He's had a history as an academic, and as many other things, which also include a political analysis on various issues. Today, we are looking at a cross-section of his interests, which include the future and present of Argentina and the Middle East. There's been several major developments lately, including the 30th anniversary of the EMEA bombing in Argentina, which has brought together this nexus of events, Middle Eastern and Latin American actors, and a great deal of consternation about the political future. Without further ado, Julian, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you said it's been a while since you've interviewed in English, but I am very much looking forward to this discussion.
On the contrary, Irina, it's a pleasure to be in your program.
So I wanted to ask you this. Basically, my question is as follows. Is the new leadership in Argentina the bellwether of political changes in Latin America? And this is something that I've been hearing from some Argentine voices, that when Argentina sneezes, the rest of Latin America catches a cold. So is the new direction of Argentina what we can expect from other countries in the region?
Well, I would say it definitely does have an impact on regional politics, but I wouldn't exaggerate or go over our heads in terms of what that impact could be. I think that it's not marking a trend, because if you look at the cases of Chile and Colombia, where they were historically pro-free market, pro-US, and right-wing governments, conservative governments, for the last few years, they've been ruled by left-wing and even radical left governments, especially in Colombia. So I am not sure that Milei's ascension to power signifies a pivotal change in this respect. I do think, however, that it can be a counterweight, so to say, to this left-wing trend that has been historically a part of Latin American politics. You have President Lula, which is part of that, but he seems to be a diminished statement in this third mandate of his. And in Argentina, you have this newcomer, which in terms of regional politics is also something quite new, to have a far-right government in a country as big and as relevant as Argentina, vis-a-vis the Latin American counterparts. So I think it's a significant event. I'm not sure it really heralds a new trend.
Well, that a lot of it remains to be seen, but for sure that could be as at least a moment of support for those countries, those few of them that do already share a similar direction, which include Paraguay and Uruguay, of course. Whether it will spread, of course, will depend on a lot of different factors. But speaking of these factors, President Milei clearly indicated that his government stands with the US and Israel and the West in general, not with Russia or China. However, how is Argentina going to manage its relationships in the Middle East, considering the collective pro-Hamas politics in that neighborhood at the moment? Can his position make a difference, or is it so tangential and so far away that it doesn't really make a difference?
Well, I think Javier Milei is someone by personality that doesn't really seem to measure much of what impact his positions actually have. He seems to be a principled man, a convinced man, someone who is really sure about his ideas, and where Argentina should be in the global system. And in this respect, he did make a choice of being actually a strong ally of Israel and a strong ally of the United States, and to be on the sides of freedom and against terror. So in this respect, I don't think he will really care much about the impact, whether negative even, for Argentine foreign relations or commercial relations that that position may have. Sometimes he does give room to his own foreign minister to maneuver, to, you know, to put up a flames that maybe he created, and to let her actually be a nice cap in this bad cap, nice cap relationship. But strategically, I think that this is a man who actually is fully convinced of where Argentina has to be, irrespective of repercussions. And you can see that when he confronts very openly and at a very personal level other leaders of Latin America, such as Lula in Brazil, Petro in Colombia, and others, where he engages in a very personal and direct exchange of insults, even sometimes, or derogatory comments. So I think that the Foreign Office in Argentina will try to tame and control whatever damage this position may or may not create in the Middle East for Argentina's interests, but it clearly will add and create a very new positive ones by a strong alliance with Israel, by improving the commercial relations, by being in good terms with America and its geopolitical interests as well, and also with Europe, which is an important business partner for Argentina.
Speaking of Europe, of course, we have seen a very much a trend where leftist governments, leftist socialists, whatever you want to call them, are basically disregarded, and Milei is focusing his visits mostly on centrist or right-wing leaders and parties, even if they are not, in fact, in the government. Some of these right-wing parties, however, such as Vox in Spain, have also been criticized for their close relationship with, in particular, Russia, also with China, since both countries seek to penetrate all aspects of the political spectrum in terms of their interests. How will Milei balance his commitment to keeping apart from Russian and Chinese influence with his interest in appearing one of the leaders of right-wing movements?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. And I think it goes to the heart of a problem, ideologically speaking, for Javier Milei and for the strategic positioning of Argentina in this global system. Because as you correctly point out, these far-right parties tend to be more sympathetic to Russia to a great extent, and to a lesser extent to China. And on other issues are actually in sync with President Milei's attitudes vis-a-vis many nations in the world. Probably there's going to be a collision. I think that won't mean that he may sort of embrace that pro-Russian stance. I honestly don't think that may happen. Probably he will coexist with some contradictions that inhabit the territory of Argentina's new partners. I think in general, the far right in Europe does have this contradiction, which is a contradiction of its own. And probably Javier Milei will connect better with the angels of this ideology, and not so much with devils involved in it.
Well,
but he will have to navigate the waters, of course.
Yes, and it will also, I guess, a lot depend on just how far these parties will go in these alliances with Russia and with China. But
Yes.
meanwhile, bringing the issues closer to the home front, today we have witnessed the completely fraudulent outcome of the elections in Venezuela, which have only been openly recognized by Russia, China, and Iran. And Venezuela has become very much a proxy for Iran's interests in Latin America. So with Maduro retaining power, it's obvious that this strategy by Iran will continue. Iran will also likely continue propping up its Hezbollah network, spreading its power through Venezuela, Cuba, various intelligence networks. How will that impact Argentina's relationships with its neighbors? And can it navigate its own security concerns, given the state of things, given that the likely attempt to penetrate the country by Iranian-backed and Venezuelan intelligence networks, coalitions with the opposition, with various domestic players?
Well, first of all, Iran, as a nation state, as an Islamic republic, has diplomatic delegations, missions, and embassies all over Latin America, and that's been for many, many years. But let's focus on the moment that the Khomeini launches his own revolution. So Iran has been a presence of Latin American politics for a long time. In terms of Hezbollah, its main proxy, it landed in Latin America in the 80s, and onwards has been expanding, creating networks, financing its illicit activities, and even committing acts of terror in the 90s, in Buenos Aires in particular, and also in Panama. That didn't prevent, actually, Argentina from incorporating Hezbollah in 2019 as in its own lists of terror-designated organizations, and the Milei government has just done it the same with Hamas, where this month it incorporated it in its own list of terror organizations. So I think this shows that Argentina retains some level of independence vis-a-vis Iran, Hezbollah, in terms of how it deals with them, irrespective of what other governments in Latin America may or may not do. For example, at the time when Cristina Fernández de Kirchner ruled Argentina, she was very, very close to Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, and other far-left actors in the region. And she did try to entice Iran into a memorandum of understanding that it was actually signed in order to improve diplomatic, political, cultural, and commercial relations. But then when Mauricio Macri's government arrived, he actually tear that memorandum apart. It was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. That former president, Fernández de Kirchner, is facing a trial for treason for siding with the Iranians. And now you have Javier Milei's government that openly sides with the US, Israel, and is challenging Iran and Hezbollah openly and publicly and very concretely. So I think that the government of Argentina will know how to move around obstacles, ideological obstacles, let's say, that other Latin American nations may put in the way, and remain on course, focused on the goal or the port where it wants Argentina to be in terms of global positioning.
Speaking of Israel, of course, Israel is currently beleaguered by many proxy wars on many fronts. In Israel, by political isolation or efforts to isolate it, and by its own internal domestic problems and political polarization. But to what extent can Israel be helpful to Argentina in offsetting these concerns, security concerns, economic concerns, all these obstacles that come in with trying to rebuild the country basically from scratch? Can private organizations such as Elan play a role, or are they just focused so far on people-to-people and private business contacts? What will it take for that relationship to really take root and have a serious benefit to both players?
Well, I think both spheres can coexist. On the one hand, the state-to-state relations, where Israel can provide a lot of assistance in the areas of intelligence, the military support, cultural initiatives, business relations, and so on. Meaning Israel is a very important nation in the Middle East and globally, and it has a lot to contribute to Argentina, and it's already been doing that. Actually, there are a lot of projects that both nations have been carrying out together for a long time. Now, in terms of, let's say, organizations, NGOs, initiatives relating to Argentina's Jewish community or Argentina at large, well, that's a different thing. And there's been a lot of engagement as well with Ilan, as you mentioned, the recently launched group, but also many other established, let's say, Jewish organizations in America like AJC, ADL, Bnei Brit, and others, who have been involved with the Latin American Jewish community, the Argentine Jewish community in particular, after the AMIA bombing, and with governments in terms of letting, let's say, political clout. Because sometimes the Jews of Latin American, Argentina is a very strong community, over 200,000 people. But there are many, many countries which are smaller, with smaller Jewish communities. And that's when the clout of the American Jewish community, its lobbying efforts, and the association that actually many people in Latin America make of the Jewish community being strong and connected to the American government, can help actually the Jewish communities all over Latin America, because governments and public opinion perceive them as being under the umbrella and the protection of the American Jewish community. So in that sense, I think that the closer the relationship, the richer the relationship, the better for these communities' own position in their own countries.
And speaking of Israel and the AMIA bombing, this is one thing that Argentina and Israel have in common. They've been both targeting by Iran-backed terrorism, and some may say that the AMIA bombing and before that the Israeli embassy bombing were precursors to October 7th, using proxies to perpetrate mass terror. And thanks to the domestic politics in Argentina, that wound remains open to this day. Still, many of the players have not been identified, much less punished. And Alberto Nisman, the prosecutor who was investigating this whole affair, has been assassinated and framed as a suicide. So how do we expect to see this issue being handled going forward, in terms of bringing the perpetrators to justice? I'm hearing discussions of a new law, but what can practically be done with the resources Argentina currently has? Second, security issues. Of course, Iran issued a threat the day of the commemoration of the bombing to essentially punish Argentina at the time of its own choosing for bringing light to this situation. And the Iranian mosque, which was central to the original case, is still out there, still functioning, presumably performing the same function. Given these limitations, given all the economic challenges, what can be done to prevent another disaster and to heal the wounds and to bring closure to the community?
Well, I fully agree with the depiction of the big picture they've just presented. I think that there are a few items, so to say, in this scenario that are not promising. The mosque, for example, that you mentioned, with people involved in the AMIA bombing, never closed. Argentina actually never broke diplomatic relations with Iran throughout these 30 years after the bombing, which was an act of war. I mean, I'm not a legal expert on international affairs, but I'm pretty sure that if a nation sends clandestine agents to violate the borders of a sovereign country and kill nationals, it pretty much resembles an act of war. Irrespective of this, Argentina never really ever broke diplomatic relations. It simply downgraded them. And I think this could be a new possible scenario, that Argentina finally makes that choice. I'm not sure they will do that, but maybe the Foreign Office under Javier Milei's instructions may. I hope certainly it might do it. Now, there's also the question of Latin American and other nations not cooperating fully with Argentina in this respect. For example, a few years ago, thanks to the work of the late Alberto Nisman, the chief prosecutor for the AMIA bombing, Interpol issued red alert signs which means that if any of those accused of being a part of the bombing had to be arrested in any country that Interpol has an office and a mandate. Nevertheless, high-ranking Iranian officials under red notices alerts actually moved around in Latin America, in countries that were even partners and allies of Israel, of Iran. I'm sorry, I kept on mixing it up. So the question is that sometimes it's a question of many nations not wanting to antagonize Iran for the sake of justice for an act that took place 3 decades ago. Now, on the other hand, I think in Argentina now there's been a new momentum created by the fact that Hamas has been incorporated in the terror lists. It's also true that the government is sponsoring a new project of carrying out a trial in absentia for the Iranians accused of being a part of the attack, and that might perhaps permit the carrying out of a trial where the accused could be finally sentenced. No, obviously Iran will never deliver on these people, but nevertheless, they say, some people argue that it might give the closure that you mentioned to the nation in this regard. The one risk about it, however, given that the Argentine justice system is sometimes, let's say, affected by political affairs, let's put it that way, it could very well be that there is a threat to this idea. The fact that out of corruption or political manipulation, those Iranians accused might be declared not guilty. So that's something that carries its own risks. However, most of society and the Jewish leadership and the national leadership seem to be bent on pursuing this course of the trial in absentia. So that may be a new, significant, potentially important development.
Speaking of that, and you mentioned these precarious obstacles, we are increasingly witnessing a very complex geopolitical picture. We are seeing waves of protests in the United States organized with Iran's help against Israel's operations in Gaza in response to October 7th. This so far has not happened in Argentina, but who knows? All these forces may unite to start some sort of civil unrest. We are seeing the elections in the United States play out in a very unpredictable way, and it's not clear what will happen. But so far, the last several administrations have essentially not prioritized Latin America. The Jewish communities, too, in the US are generally supportive, of course, but the contacts have not been wide or consistent. So in light of all these things bringing them together, what do you think? And in light of all these challenges and opportunities, what do you think should be, needs to be done? What would be ideal from all these actors? How to prevent the civil unrest from being instigated? What would be ideal for the US to do, whoever ends up in the White House come January? And what sort of relationship do you think is possible with the American Jewish community, with the European Jewish communities, with the other Jewish communities around the world that are not as connected?
Well, let me summarize it this way. I think that the Argentina Jewish community could benefit a lot from more dynamic relations with Jewish communities anywhere in the world, especially in the America, especially in Europe, especially in nations where liberal democracies rule, let's say, no? The more prosperous and the more freer a society will have much more to contribute to the Jewish communities in Argentina and in Latin America. In terms of a new American administration in January, I don't think it may significantly change the nature of the relationship of the US and Argentina and the US vis-a-vis Jewish communities in Argentina and in Latin America, because I think that it's sort of a given that there's a good relationship to be preserved. The question has more to do with the tricky issue of Israel and the now Palestinian Arab Islamic Iranian conflict, let's say, where for most of the part, public opinion is exposed to a biased media, is exposed to political pressure from other actors, infiltration, as you suggested as well, and that could get a bit more complicated. So far, Argentina's university campuses, let's say, although we do not have the exact same concept of a campus, we have buildings, more specifically to say, that they haven't been truly co-opted or affected by pro-Palestinian or even radical pro-Hamas demonstrations. These are spaces where, for the most part, left-wing and even far-left ideas prevail. So it's pretty easy for these areas to be under the influence of Iranian agents, because they can easily manipulate students into believing that to be properly revolutionary, pro-anti-establishment means to be with the Palestinian people, which in their view means being with Hamas and against Israel, guilty by association of being a partner of the US and the free world. So in this sense, this is historical, and in Venezuela and Bolivia, in Nicaragua, in Cuba, and in other very radically ruled nations, Iran was able to actually pull this off. In Argentina, not so much, even though the media, even conservative media, sometimes equivocates and confuses its own audience with a partial and biased coverage of what's going on in the Middle East. For the most part, Argentine universities have been preserved from these malign influences. But there is a problem, because the tendency to be anti-Israel is there.
So, of course, Argentina is facing an information war as much as it faces economic, security, and other practical issues. Whether President Milei will be able to reshape this landscape, this information landscape, by the sheer strength of his personality, whether he'll be able to recruit enough support on the ground to turn this tide around into a different sort of social movement, political movement, not just an incidental election as a sort of response to decades of mismanagement, remains to be seen. But on that note, as we wrap up, I want to ask you, given your history of writing books that delve deeply into sometimes surprising matters, what do you see in writing next? What issue do you see taking up and digging into in light of all these fascinating new developments?
Well, let me first mention something about what you said about whether Javier Milei's ascension may be a moment or something of a longer impact, no? If I understood correctly what you were saying. I think that the fact that a president of Argentina is so vocally, openly, staunchly pro-Israel and pro-Jewish helps to legitimize in the public opinion the idea that it is okay to be a partner with Israel, that it is okay to embrace Judaism. And this is good, because historically Argentina has been a Catholic nation, crisscrossed by many ideologies, but philo-Zionism was not one of them. That generally was the preview of the Jewish communities and a few friends out there. So the fact that such an influential figure, both politically and culturally, is so openly pro-Israel and pro-Jewish, I think it's a very, very good thing, because this is unlike the United States, where the Jewish community and Jewish values and Jewish vocabulary are so strongly enshrined in American culture, no? Not so in Argentina. So this may assist in that regard. The risk, of course, is that if Milei fails economically, for example, or politically, his association and fondness for the Jewish community, for Judaism in general, and for Israel could boomerang. That's a risk, of course. But for the most part, in the balance, I would say it's more a positive thing than a bad thing. And your final question was, can you repeat that?
About your own prospects, for what are you planning on writing next, given your history of delving deeply into various and sometimes unusual issues?
Okay. But for the most part, I am very reserved about my next topics, I have to say. But in light of our conversation, I think, there's been a lot of stimulus to write about many issues. I think that a very interesting topic may be, I'm not saying I may address it, but for anyone, would be to explore Javier Milei's psychology and personality, why he's so close to Judaism and to Israel, and of course, what impact it may have on Argentina's public opinion in terms of validating Israel and Judaism here. Nevertheless, it's important to make a distinction, I think. Most Argentinians are not anti-Semitic. For the most part, you have a very pro-Jewish atmosphere, so to say. The question is that nowadays anti-Semitism camouflages as anti-Zionism. And that's when things get a bit confused, because then, yes, you do have a lot of people who hate Israel, even though they may have friends who are Jewish. That phenomenon is real. And that, I think, the cure for that is information, education, and presenting the facts that sometimes don't really reach Latin American audiences, and in a consistent fashion. Not the occasional article that may be published to outbalance the negative trend, but actually we are lacking a systemic and systematic campaign of information where the facts, not propaganda, just the facts may be presented clearly to the Latin American audience.
Well, thank you so much for this insight. I know you want to keep your work a little bit of a mystery and a surprise, but I, for one, am certainly looking forward to finding out what it is when the time is right, and I think that the audience will be kept in suspense as well. And I certainly wish you the best of success with whatever comes. I think a lot of these questions and topics we will be at some point revisiting as things progress and develop, and hopefully the positive trends will ultimately prevail. And thanks for everyone who's been watching us. And Julian Schvindlerman, please check out his work, his articles, his books. A lot of it in Spanish, but there's also English language articles as well, and hopefully a lot of the Spanish writing will also be translated at some point. And if not, this is as good a reason as any to learn Spanish. And
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me in your show, and congratulations on this endeavor.
Thank you so much. And we'll be back, of course, next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you for everyone who joined us tonight, and have a great evening.